What I'd like to do today is to really take the sum of the last few weeks and build on that, and inshallah have a dialogue with it, because I think we've reached a sort of milestone in the evolution of 19th century thought, which can be in some ways considered distinct and a unity in itself. In the 20th century, major events already transpired, especially after the First World War and after the period between the wars, which had a major impact on the evolution of Islamic thought. So you can't say that there was really a juncture between 19th century thought and 20th century thought, although there is obviously a continuum. And the entire spectrum of thoughts and beliefs that began to gel together in the 19th century to begin the process of what we now call modernism or modern Islamic. All of them somehow crystallized around the idea of Pan-Islam. Towards the end of the 19th century, we had a situation where there was a type of recognition that it was necessary to keep the integrity of the major Muslim state intact. And we're now talking about the Ottoman Empire. So, although you had peoples, especially in the Arab countries and in some of the Muslims of the Asiatic countries, Turkestan, for example, who may have at some point in their history been under the control of either the Turkish, the Ottoman, or the Persian empires, and they may have resisted Ottoman administration or Persian administration for their own peculiar local conditions. As imperialism began to encroach, and as the Western powers began to take over parts of Muslim territory, there was a redefinition of loyalties in the minds of most Muslims. So you had a sense that the only thing that can keep the West at bay, the only thing that can keep the encroachments of foreign powers at bay, is the re-strengthening of the Muslim states that were still prevalent. Of course, the Mughal Empire in India collapsed. So by the end of the 19th century, you really had a very weak Muslim state in Iran, which was barely able to keep its own territorial integrity intact. And you had an Ottoman Empire that seemed to galvanize itself once again to stop the encroachment on its territory by Western powers. Now, throughout the 19th century, as we've learned, large sections of the Ottoman Empire were detached from it. Parts of North Africa, Algeria, Tunisia, the Balkans, although the Balkans, parts that were ceded were primarily Christian, but still, they had substantial Muslim populations, and we're talking about also the encroachments on Muslim territory by the Russians, and the various treaties between the Russians and the Turks, where the Turks had to withdraw certain parts of the northern Black Sea to Crimea. So, towards the end of the 19th century, there was an attempt to put a stop to all this, and to stop the inner rebellion against the Ottoman state. Because the alternative would have been the destruction of whatever Muslim power existed in these countries. So, somewhere around the accession of Sultan Abdul Hamid, say in the 1870s, and even before that, with his predecessor, Sultan Abdul Aziz, you had the Ottoman state began to think of ways in which they could mobilize Muslim opinion for really two purposes. The first purpose is to stop the discontent that existed within the Ottoman Empire. And the second is to strengthen the most important Muslim state there, which was the Ottoman state, by making it, as it were, the protector of all Muslims in the world. And that was the beginning, one say, of the idea of Pan-Islam. Pan-Islam, which is derived from the Arabic word, al-Ittihad al-Islami, or sometimes it's called al-Jami al-Islami. meant really many things to many people, but depending on the perspective that you took. If you looked at it from a political perspective, it was the utilization of the sentiment of Muslims throughout the world in the service of the political power of the Ottoman state. If you look at it from a literary, cultural perspective, it's the reaffirmation of Islamic standards in culture, education, in literature, and so on. If you look at it from the perspective of the military, as it were, it is again a mechanism by which various states, Muslim states, could organize themselves together so that singly they may be defeated, but together they may overcome whatever external threats there are. So it began to be a catchword. Jamia al-Islamiyya or the Ittihad al-Islami was an attempt to to reconnect between the Muslims living in various Muslim states and the central powers of the Muslim world, namely the Ottoman state. In the process, obviously, a lot of things were thrown up, and a lot of issues came to the fore. It's not very easy to talk about Pakistan in the form of, let's say, political unity when you have competing states like Iran and Turkey. It's not easy again to talk about the role of the Ottoman Sultan in his capacity as Khalifa if you have a state like Iran which espouses the Shia madhab and does not necessarily subscribe to the theory of Khilafah. So all of these contradictions, all of these conflicts, which were prior to this period, were really not formulated as such. They had not crystallized as a mechanism of strengthening the power of the state and by influence the power of Islamic Muslims. In the late 19th century, they all came to a head. So if you look at the activities of the people that we discussed in the last 6 or 7 talks, they took up certain threads of this story and tried to crystallize the response from that particular vantage point. For example, Afghani is probably the first person to talk about the need of Muslims to give allegiance, irrespective of their sect, to the Ottoman state, because this was the only state that was capable, even if it was weak, of withstanding the encroachment of the West. If you look at people like, say, Amir Abdul his jihad was a mechanism by which the resistance of Muslims to direct foreign imperial control by Western powers was best manifested, and he became a kind of symbol as to how one could resist the encroachments of Western powers. And his name and his example was used considerably by the Ottomans subsequently in the 1890s after he was safely dead to stoke, as it were, the fires of resistance in places like Tunisia. So, if you look at again people like Khalidi, Khalidi was a person who tried to use the diplomatic strength and the diplomatic relations of the Ottoman state in a way that would strengthen the external defense of the state, and so on. All of these came to a head with the accession of Sultan Hamid to power. He began to seriously plan to use Islam as a concrete mechanism, a concrete ideology to strengthen his regime and to strengthen his claims to the Khilafah. Before that, the Muslim Khilafah really was not utilized a lot by the Ottomans. They ruled primarily as sultans, not as Khilafah. And only towards the end of the 18th century, when Russians began to encroach considerably against the Ottoman state, did the Ottoman sultans begin to seriously take the title of Khalifa. And the first time it ever was used as such is in the treaty, famous treaty between the Russians and the Turks at the end of the first Russo-Turkish War, where the treaty referred to the Ottoman Sultan as a protector of all Muslims. Which means really the role of Khilafah and the role of the Khalifa was given a new breath of life, as it were, a new lease of life, as a result of the decline in the political fortunes of the Muslim powers. Neither the Mughal Empire claimed the title of Khilafah, neither did the Shia Empire in Iran. In fact, Shia Empire in Iran does not believe in the concept of Khilafah, or did not believe in the concept of Khilafah, so they had no claims beyond the territorial limits of that. But the Ottoman Sultan did, and the Ottoman Sultan ruled for hundreds of years in the name of Khilafah, but without really gelling or crystallizing what that meant in real practical terms. So we had, as it were, the redefinition of what the Khalifa meant, Khalifa al-Muslimin, sometime in the mid-19th century. And this became a very important element in the overall armory, as it were, of policies and programs and plans that the Ottoman state used to fend off encroachments by foreign powers and to strengthen its claim on its existing territories. So, at the beginning of the end of the 19th century, we had, as it were, the redefinition and rebirth, don't call it, of Khilafah. So, in the pantheon, as it were, of pan-Islamic ideas and concepts, Khilafah is critical. Khilafah is an important element of the ideology of pan-Islam. So, even today, if you look at those parties, political parties, that expound the principle of Khilafah and talk about the need to introduce the Khilafah as a way of rejuvenating the Muslim world, they should be able to place their own definition of Khilafah meant to this 19th century definition. Because before that, it really played very little part. I mean, if you look at the last Abbasi Khalifa and the attempts to connect the Ottoman power or the Ottoman state with the last Abbasi Khalifa, you find the links are extremely tenuous. And to a large extent, the Ottoman Sultan did not rule as a Khalifa. He left religious affairs and the affairs of the entire hierarchy of administering the Sharia. He left it to the ulama. And nobody thought of the Ottoman Sultan as the final arbiter of matters of religion. But in the late 19th century, it re-emerged, or it emerged, that the Khalifa, in this case, Sultan Hamid, began to consider himself to be a true arbiter of the religious affairs of Muslims, and as part of his weaponry, as it were, he had with him 4 or 5 religious advisors, each one from a certain part of the Muslim world, who advised him on matters of Sharia, so that when he made appointments or made administrative decisions dealing with the deen, he could always claim legitimacy from his title of Khalifa. So, an important element of the ideology of pan-Islam is the redefinition of the concept of Khilafah. The second element of the ideology of pan-Islam is what I would call non-sectarianism. It has to be by its very nature non-madhab. Once it begins to take a certain madhabi influence, then the pan idea precipitates. Pan is a Greek word that means across various divides. So, if you begin to think of pan-Islam, or Jihad Islami, or Jama'at Islami, in just madhabi terms, you obviously are going to exclude large segments of the Muslim world from your planning, from your definition. And in this case, there was always a very powerful undercurrent to the claims of the Khalifa for pan-Islamic rule, is an attempt on his part to create really strong alliances, especially with Iran. So in the context of the Ottoman Empire, Pan-Islam meant close relationships with other Muslim states, and in this case Iran, because there's only two other Muslim states left at the end of the 19th century. One of them is Iran, and the other one is Afghanistan, which has been eaten up in any case. So the ideology of Pan-Islam implied necessarily a rapprochement across the madhabs. And in fact, there is very good evidence that towards the end of the 19th century, Sultan al-Hamid was trying to reach some kind of alliance with Iran, so to bridge this sectarian divide and to create a kind of Muslim bloc. Unfortunately, the person who was talking to Nasruddin Shah was assassinated, and the whole process had to be given a new definition, as it were, but he was deposed himself soon after that. So, Pan-Islam, Khilafah, non-sectarianism. The third element of Pan-Islam, if you want to call it that, is an attempt to create transnational loyalties. That is, loyalties to the center, in this case the Ottoman Empire, or the Caliphate, by peoples who are not under his direct control. So, sometime towards the end of the 19th century, the state in Istanbul started taking seriously the need to preach the message of Pan-Islam to people who are outside of its control. So you had, for example, newspapers being printed and circulated in Istanbul in Turkish and Arabic and distributed to places that were resisting French power, for example in Tunisia. You have the famous case where the Ottoman consuls in Southeast Asia, in Java, became involved in local politics and began to promote the claims of the Ottoman Sultan to the Khilafah, and they were finally expelled by the Dutch. So, and you have many cases of the Ottoman state beginning to take its claims to being the center of Pan-Islam seriously by sending these newspapers, by funding political parties and movements, by creating forums and clubs and organizations throughout the Muslim world that was not under their control in order to promote the claims of the Ottoman Sultan as a Khalifa. So this is the third leg, as it were, of the ideology of Pakistan. Khilafah, non-sectarianism, and loyalties of all Muslims to the center, irrespective of the current political and cultural conditions. By the end of the 19th century, this became really quite an alarming event in Europe. And you can see also the genesis of the resistance to the ideology of Pan-Islam, although it was never really translated into a set of specific policies and specific programs. It was still vague. You can see in Europe in particular, Russia to a lesser extent, the fear that these Muslims throughout the world, there were hundreds of millions under the control of the British, tens of millions under the control of the Russians and the French, may begin somehow to transfer their loyalties from their current masters to the Khalifa in Istanbul and create therefore great instability and a sense of rebelliousness in all these countries. And a lot of the arguments or a lot of the fears that we read today can easily be seen in the late 19th century when European newspapers started talking about the Khalifa mobilizing hundreds of millions of Muslims throughout the world who are going to lead a jihad against European powers, and all the fears that are common currency nowadays, all this Islamophobia, at the official level, began to spring up in the late 19th century. So the ideology of Pan-Islam may have had, Afghani may have been the first serious advocate of it. And in my mind, probably was the first serious advocate of it, in the sense of these three items. He accepted that the Khalifa in Istanbul should in fact be the premier or the prime political leader of the Muslim world. And he made the supposition or the statement that the Iranian Shah should fall under the Khilafah of the Ottoman state, even though he may have political power within Iran itself. So he gave primacy, the first order of priority in the hierarchy of Muslim political power, he gave to the Khalifa in Istanbul. Non-sectarianism his entire life, as we have seen, he never exhibited any overt sectarianism. He may have switched the way that he presented himself to various audiences, but he himself did not espouse a particular method. Where he was forced to take a position, he took a position based upon the strengthening of the Khilafah, and therefore strengthening of the power of the Ottoman state. And his entire work in the last 10 or 15 years of his life, in fact, was related to these developing a transnational base, a non-national base of support for the Ottoman Khilafah. So, this is one current. The other currents that we have also fell into the same direction. So, all of these, some coalesced into a movement that became really quite powerful, at least at the intellectual level. It became quite a powerful source of ideology for Muslims who were aware of the sad state which they had sunk, and who believed that the only thing that we can do is by strengthening the structures, even though they were weak, of Muslim rule. And the best thing to do was to strengthen the Khilafah and therefore strengthen the power of the state. So this is really the situation that we find ourselves towards the end of the 19th century. And this situation continued until the deposition of Sultan al-Hamid. The young Turks who took over power in Turkey. Of course, they kept the notion of Khilafah, but primarily to support their own political agenda. But what's the point of a Khalifa who has no temporal power, who has no power as a Sultan? And they found that by the time World War I started, they found that they had to redefine the nature of the Khilafah once again, so that it really accrues to the state of Muslims rather than to an individual. But by that time it was probably too late. However, as I was saying earlier, the fears that Pan-Islam created in the Western mind led really to basically an industry, a late 19th century industry of articles and journals and books that talked about the Islamic threat, that talked about hordes of Muslims descending upon Western garrisons and outlying posts of these imperial outposts of their empires. They talked about rolling back of the imperial powers in North Africa and Asia. And of course in places like India, they played to the sentiment of Indian Muslims that they were going to have another mutiny there and the British are going to be wiped out. In Indonesia, what was then a Dutch colony in the Dutch East Indies, the same thing. So, if you compare, say, the late 19th century to the late 20th century, 5 years ago, even now, you find really the same thing coming up. Different guises, different villains. But behind it all is this fear that somehow if you can overcome the divisions of Muslims and create for them a certain political center, a certain cultural center, you can mobilize the religious fervor in the interest of Muslim power and become a threat to Western designs. So 19th century, late 19th century, in many ways is no different from the late 20th century, except the actors have mainly changed. If any of you have read any books about First World War authors, there's a number of them who write about this fear of the Muslims coming together under some kind of Mahdi. All these are, of course, fictional writing. If you read the writings of a man called John Buckingham, he was a great writer of adventure stories, and his heroes were mainly British secret service agents foiling the plots of Islamic fanatics in raising the masses in places like Africa and India and so on. All this can be traced to hysteria, the first signs of Islamophobia in the late 19th century. So it has seeped into, as it were, the culture in the West, the mindset that Muslims are fanatic, they owe loyalties beyond their nation state. There is always the possibility that somebody will come up and mobilize all of these people, either a Khalifa or a Mahdi, and they selectively focus on people like the Mahdi in Sudan, the various machinations of Sultan Abdul Hamid, the Indian mutiny, the fear that the Turks would be able to mobilize the Indians against the British, which would have undermined their war effort in World War I and so on. All of these things are really were given some kind of political and some basis of legitimacy amongst the public by these articles and writings that focus on the threat that may come from the Muslim world against the West. And so there's several trends that go into creating the perception of Muslims in the Western world. One of them, as you all know, are the Crusades. The other one, a very important one, is this late 19th century fear that the activities of Sultan Abdul Hamid in trying to strengthen the Ottoman state by calling on the religious support of Muslims outside of its territories is a threat to Western power. And in some ways this may be reflected by the way that the West received the news of the Iranian Revolution. Instead of Sultan Hamid and Mahdi, they have Ayatollah Khomeini and so on. So the groundwork for this kind of thinking, this Islamophobic thinking, that goes beyond just straight Christian Muslim antagonism, can somehow be linked to the response of Sultan Hamid. Obviously, it also has a major impact on Muslims themselves. Here we have the first time that an official ideology has been developed, as it were, by the state that went beyond just strict political power. There is an attempt to give some moral basis, some ethical basis to the claims of a Muslim state for loyalty, for people to support it. And the activities of Sultan and the supporters that he had. And some of them were drawn from all parts of the Muslim world. We had several Arabs who supported him, who were in his inner circle, several people from Northern Caucasus, from Dagestan and so on. So he was really in some ways himself quite a non-ethnic figure. He genuinely believed in the need to maintain a non-ethnic basis to the state. And that kind of ideology had a great impact on a large number of Muslims subsequently. So we have people like Rashid Rada, people like Shakib al-Salam, who kept the symbols of Pan-Islam alive, even though the Khilafah ended. And it maintains its power to this very day. Most Muslims have really no problem with these. They have no problem about the theoretical need for a Khilafah. They have no problem about the need to maintain a non-sectarian dimension to Islam. They have no problem in reconciling their loyalties to Islam as a whole, even in its political manifestations, and their loyalties to specific countries, specific states, even though they may be non-Muslim.
So the impact that Sultan al-Hamid had on this whole spectrum of pan-Islamic thought, which subsequently crept into, in various ways and means and guises, in the political, intellectual platforms of political parties, or cultural organizations, or individual thinkers, really should not be underestimated. So what I'd like to do now is to really ask a few leading questions and see what your own views are. Try to discuss these three concepts. Let's take the first one, Khilafah. Is it possible to have a Muslim state without Khilafah? Or without some kind of combination of political and spiritual authority? Is it necessary? What do you think? Is Khilafah necessary for legitimacy of a Muslim state?
In my particular opinion, I think the views of putting a person or a title, Khilafah, which is, in a sense, derived from the Muslims' understanding of the rule of the Prophet himself. So, in a sense, they say that, obviously they will refer to the ayah of the Quran, A Allawi, Khalifa, they will say that there was a Khalifa on earth. So, but to me, the most important thing is not the title itself. To me, the most important thing is the leader, which has the basic quality of the most quality in spirituality and most quality in being medical in administration or in knowledge of religion, in order to fulfill it in this modern world.
Should he rule? Should he have the power to rule?
Obviously, because
What do you think?
I think Khilafah is very necessary because the Khalifa must have the authority and must have the power that is final role in his hands. Because of having Khalifa, there will be more economically, more such as the authority in the West.
But this authority is specific to that particular country. The authority of Wilayat al-Faqih, for example, which is very similar to the concept of Khilafah, is specific to the territory of Iran. You cannot have the Wali al-Amr giving fatwas on two people who are unable to implement them in the context of their own societies. So, I come back to my question. The Khilafah that was there under the last years of the Ottoman Empire, under the pan-Islamic ideology, you had a state here, and that state combined, at least theoretically, the political authority under the Sultan and the spiritual authority under the Khalifa. And by spiritual authority, I mean the entire structure of religious hierarchy and administration ended up with the Khalifa. And the Khalifa had a number of people who were advising as to what to do and gave him recommendations, but ultimately the power was his. That Khilafah of the late Ottoman Empire was a Khilafah that obliged people to see that person as a legitimate religious authority. Now, we are now in a situation where nobody in the Muslim world has claimed Khilafah. No Muslim state, no leader of a Muslim state has claimed Khilafah. For a number of reasons. One of them is that the Khilafah has been abolished for the last 80 years, 90 years. The other reason is that there is no connection between the Khalifa today and the string of Khulafa that ended with the last Abbasi Khalifa. Don't forget, the Ottomans, when they claimed the Khilafah for themselves, created some kind of linkage between the last the descendant of the last Abbasi Khalif, who's living in Cairo. And when Sultan Salim conquered Egypt, they dug this fellow up, and he transferred the Khilafah, the authority of the Khilafah, to Sultan Salim. So the Ottoman emperors, even though they were not Qurayshis, even though they were not direct descendants of them, claimed legitimacy from that Khilafah. In the context of the ideology of the Muslim state, what Sultan Abdul Hamid in Pan-Islam said in the late 19th century is that you as a Muslim cannot function completely as a complete Muslim being unless your political side of your life is governed by loyalty to a central authority whose legitimacy is directly linked to the line of Khilafah that goes back to the Prophet ﷺ. So, this is a cornerstone of the ideology. No Muslim state possible without Khilafah. There are a number of subsequent theories that came up as to whether a Muslim state is in fact possible. And there are many countries that have various degrees of Islamicized constitutions that do not claim Khilafah for the leadership. I mean, King Fahd doesn't claim he's a Khalifa of the Muslim, although you can't say that Saudi Arabia is not based to a large extent, at least in theory, on Quranic principles of Sharia, and so on. So, Khilafah, the idea that the rejuvenation or the rebirth of Muslims and the Muslim state can take place without the presence of a Khalifa, without the presence of a Khalifa who has actual authority, is really quite a recent phenomenon. Before that, it never arose. Before that, both functions were joined up in the person of this person, the Sultan who became the Khalifa. And in some cases, the further away you went from the center, the more people did feel a kind of loyalty to it. For example, the greatest wave of resistance to the abolition of the Khilafah did not take place in Turkey or a nearby Arab country. It took place in India. So the further away you went from the center of Khilafah authority, the more people felt a kinship to it, the more people felt a need for it. And I think he was wise enough and clever enough and astute enough to understand that. Now, how this has transferred into modern times, this idea of, you have to just look at the political platform of some of the Islamic parties, Hizb al-Tahrir, that their solution, as it were, to the problems of weakness, divisiveness, relative backwardness, is to plot out this concept of Khilafah. So, and it seems you seem to believe in that too. You seem to believe that Khilafah is necessary.
I believe exactly that. Or I think if there is a leader who is able to do that, he should be the leader, but it does not mean that he takes the time of Khilafah. I think the whole issue of the Khilafah itself, why it was faced, was because the Muslims, in a sense, okay, they say God put out the viewpoint, he was losing land taken from him, and he was losing believers as well. And from the Muslim standpoint, that they were weak. And in a sense, they need the Khilafah in order for them to understand they are the big brothers who look after themselves, who use after them. So I mean, in this era, in this modern world now, I don't think that is relevant anymore. What is relevant now is for the Muslims to organize themselves and get their own strength, own their own being, own their own self. And if their just leader comes, or their racist just leader amongst them, they elect him as a leader.
But how do you solve the problem of transnational loyalties? How do you solve the problem of having the need to maintain your working life in an environment which may be alien in terms of laws, in terms of customs and mores, from the center of authority?
You could have Why can't you have a cooperation amongst Muslims? I think that's another solution.
So you don't think that the ideology of Pan-Islam, as the culmination, as it were, of 19th century resistance to Western encroachment at the physical level and intellectual level, is a valid ideology and just a passing phase?
I don't think so. I guess because if you move on in that, so I don't mean necessarily that when we have a Khilafah all problems will be solved. We won't. It's all problems. We have a problem with that. The whole issue is what we can really understand, where they're standing in this modern world, in order for them to be good at doing how they counter other issues and stuff.
But still the question raises itself. The question poses itself. That is, you have the theoretical possibility, let's say. Let's talk now in terms of ideal situations. You have the theoretical possibility of redefining the functions and the role of a Khalifa. In some ways this has happened in Iran. In some ways the notion of Wilayat al-Faqih, even though it is anchored in a whole chain of peculiarly Shia thought, is in fact a redefinition of Khilafah. And in some ways, if you look at the details of it, if you ever read the Iranian constitution, the details of the role of the Wali is not much different from the Khalifa as seen in traditional, not traditional, but let's say late 19th century Sunni thought. So the two functions are the same. The Khilafah of Sultan al-Hamid may have been prompted by the need to, as you said, to stop encroachments, to stop the disintegration of his power and state. But it was obviously a powerful ideology. It's resonated with the belief amongst a large number of Muslims that their life, as Muslims, cannot be complete unless they have a source of authority that is legitimate and that they can respond to and rely on in times of need. So that chain of thought, as it were, that silsila, has maintained a very strong afterlife, even though the end of the Khilafah was in the early 1920s.
What kind of development should be of Muslim nations now coming together, probably in an ideal world, probably the OIC.
This is phase 2, inshallah, next week. This is the phase 2 of the Pan-Islamic movement after the loss of the Khilafah. The Pan-Islamic movement, after the abolition of the Khilafah, had to reinvent itself because the sentiment was there. You had these hundreds of millions of people who were looking to support and leadership from a certain direction. The head of that was cut off. The central authority of power pulled out from, basically abdicated this responsibility and left these people at a loss as to what to do. So if you look at the period, say, from 1920s, right through the 1940s, 1950s, and then, of course, in the 1970s, once again, but with different guys, there were a number of conferences to try to resurrect this concept, try to, in fact, put some flesh on what you were saying. That is, an attempt to reproduce a Khilafah in the form of a much more intertwined set of economic and political relationships between Muslim countries. But this went into another direction, and up another direction. The political dimension of Khilafah has not been resolved adequately.
Still, I read the Khalif's books. Even him, he tried to justify the concept of Wilayat is an extension of the Khilafah.
Yes, but the Wilayat al-Faqih it is territorially defined.
No, I mean that whole idea is repeating itself in a sense to your world is really very.
What about the sectarian side? Is Khilafah possible in a sectarian Muslim world? If you have,
It is even universal that there is no Shia.
but I mean they have fought, a lot of people have fought these ideas somewhat on sectarian grounds. I mean the claim for Khilafah by Sultan al-Hamid was resisted by a large number of Shia. So you can't say that the claims, even if it's couched in non-sectarian terms, has been allowed to transcend sectarian considerations. And the same thing is true with that. That is, no matter how you devise it, no matter how you justify it and explain it, it will always have a sectarian dimension to a large number of people. Whether you believe in that or not is not the point, because that a large number of people believe that this is something that's unique to that particular sect, and therefore cannot be seen beyond the confines of that sect. What all this really brings me to say is that as we go, inshallah, into the 20th century, you find out that Muslim thought moves away from more of an instinctive, reactive response to Western power and Western encroachments into more of an attempt to define the ideological basis, the intellectual basis, the ethical basis of the redefinition of modern Islam. What we just talked about, for example, the role of the Khalifa, Wali al-Amr, Wali al-Faqih, is really not something that is theoretical. It's something that has become a very important factor in the redefinition of concepts and ideas that are of use and that are relevant to Islam, the Ottoman state, mainly to stop the encroachments of Western power. That doesn't mean it didn't have any reality and substance to it. It did. But it was primarily a policy that was designed in order to strengthen the state. It was not a policy that was designed in order to change the mindset of Muslims and change the way that Muslims think about key ideas and concepts governing their understanding of Islam. Now, as you move into the 20th century, these things, as I said, the groundwork of Muslim thought changes. And changes from being reactive, from being responsive, from being challenged, into one that tries to seek solutions within the self-definition of Islam. So, what was really an imperial ideology, that is the ideology of the late Ottoman state, turns in the 20th century into concepts that intellectuals, ulamas and thinkers struggle with to come up with a solution that is intellectually and religiously and morally acceptable to Muslims throughout. So the necessity for Khilafah for Sultan al-Hamid is really to strengthen the bonds of Muslims outside of his control to his person and to the state. In the 20th century, the definition of Khilafah is really to do with how Muslims should rule themselves and what are the limits to the power of the Khalifa, of the Wali al-Faqih, the limits to his authority and the legitimacy of that. So the rules change. And the same thing happens to the issue of transnational loyalty. In the past, as I said, in the 19th century, the issue of transnational loyalty was, should an Indian Muslim or should a Japanese Muslim have loyalty to the Khalifa? In the 20th century, transnational loyalty is to some extent replaced by deferring loyalties within a single state. Can you be loyal to a state that is avowedly secular? Can you be loyal to a regime or a set of rulers who do not use Islam as the principal basis for their laws, for their legitimation, or for the way that they conduct themselves? But the redefinition of the problem doesn't really change the problem itself. The problem just manifests itself in a different way. And I'm sure if we do not resolve these issues ourselves in our lifetime, they'll manifest themselves again in different shapes and forms. But always around these 3 or 4 key themes. Does Muslim rule require a kind of spiritually sanctioned or if not spiritually sanctioned, at least historically sanctioned power. Can there be Muslim rule that crosses ethnicity and especially sectarianism? And can you have Muslim rule that allows a person to maintain his allegiance to his Islam, to his deen, while being forced, or in some cases not forced, willingly accept to live under a different set of rules and different sets of codes of conduct? So from these crude definitions of the late 19th century, we have this whole, the door was opened up, as it were, to how Muslims respond to democracy, how Muslims respond to secular rule, how Muslims respond to loyalties, conflicts between non-Muslim states in which they live and the Muslim world as a whole, loyalties to other Muslims. It opens up the issue of, will there ever be the possibility of finding common denominators that will allow people to cross sectarian divides? Or will the solutions of Muslim power, or Muslim powerlessness, I would say, have to be local? Can they ever be generalized? Is there such a thing as a Muslim world? Or is it just a large number of states that happen to have majority or minority populations that are Muslim? So these are the current themes and the current issues, and not yet resolved satisfactorily. One of the questions that I ask myself is, can you really have a Muslim state with a Khalifa that does not allow itself to expand, to incorporate other territories? The answer, obviously, in the current world order is no, because any attempt to expand the boundaries of a Muslim state is always resisted at whatever level. It's resisted at the international level, it's resisted at the regional level, it's resisted at the local level. A very bad example, obviously, is the way in which some justification was given by a lot of serious thinkers to the expansion of Iraq to include Kuwait. Now, this may be seen as an act of naked aggression, but I remember there were a large number of people. There was a conference in Baghdad in late 1990, which had really some serious thinkers there who thought of this whole process as being the beginning of the expansion of the Muslim state, that all these states would be absorbed into a larger entity. I don't want to comment on Saddam there, and it's not the time for it. But the main issue there is, should or could a person claiming that he represents the prevailing thought as to legitimacy of Muslim power, can that person or that state expand its territory? And the answer seems to be no. So there is boundaries. There are boundaries to the kind of desires that we have. There are limits to the way in which our own perceptions as to what constitutes the ideal Muslim society can ever be realized. And will this realization be allowed, even if it's theoretically possible? So, one of the questions that arises is that with the destruction of the Khilafah, or the abolition of the Khilafah, any possible attempt to reconstruct a widespread, territorially widespread Muslim state that acquires its size and its scale through not through conquest, but through accretions, through additions to its territory, does not seem to be on. It's not possible. There have been attempts to expand the size of Muslim states, but not for Islamic reasons. For example, various attempts at Arab unity in Egypt and Syria. There was, in some ways, Muslim thinkers in the 1950s welcomed that, even though these two states were just secular, entirely secular, and they were driven by motives that were completely unrelated to the union or the attempt to create a larger entity of it. So Islam has not been allowed to present itself as the cement for the expansion of political states. And there is a reason for that, I think. And the reason is the loss of the center, the loss of the legitimacy, even though it is indirect, even though it's distant, that was given to the Khilafah. So, if by some miracle the Ottoman state maintained itself and was not abolished after World War I, or if they chose the right side, and the severance of the Arab countries from the Ottoman state did not take place, it may have been possible to add to other units. Possibly Egypt would be allowed to come back, in the sense that Egypt never cut off its links with the Ottoman state. But you had a state that was the last one of its kind, that was organized to a large extent around Muslim notions of legitimacy, Muslim notions of sovereignty. You can't say that about the Safavid state, or the Iranian state, or the Qajar state. Qajar state always thought in terms of the territorial limits of the Iranian plateau. They never took upon themselves more than that. So, with the collapse of that state, the pan-Islamic ideology, or Khilafah, non-sectarianism, transnationalism, ended. And we really have to, in the last 100 years, Muslims have been grappling with different formulations of ideology, different formulations of their fiqh, to come up with the right ideological background, as it were, to reconstruct Muslim states. Can we take a break now? And then we'll reassemble in 5 minutes, inshallah. Inshallah, we'll continue now with what happened to the main proponents of the, who were the main proponents of the pan-Islamic ideology? Who were these people? They came under different forms, but most of them were the successors of what were called the young Ottomans. I may have mentioned them to you before. And there's a man called Nana Kamal. Young Ottomans were those people who were involved in the Tanzimat movement. They were active in the middle of the 19th century, trying to create or to promote the principle of loyalty to the Ottoman state. That the Ottoman state should be beyond sects, beyond religions, and should have a common set of laws that apply to all of the citizens, and that there should be, they wanted to promote the notion of loyalty to the Ottoman state as such, rather than loyalty to a particular ethnic group or a particular national group.
So they were the outcomes that come in.
Yes, the outcomes that come in. But by the time the late 19th century rolled up, and there was ever shrinking basis for the Ottoman state, they couldn't really skirt around the main cement or main glue that was keeping the state together, which is Islam. So a lot of the young Ottomans who had called for basically a non-religious state towards the end of the 19th century changed their ideology and began to emphasize the Islamic nature of the state. And what happened really, which also adds some substance or some substantiation to the statement that Sultan al-Hamid himself was practiced what he preached, that is, it wasn't purely political. In his regime, Muslims were being given serious preferences. Preferences in the administration, preferences in business, preferences in licensing, preferences in schooling, and so on. In the middle of the 19th century, as a result of the Tanzimat and so on, basically the state was opened up to nearly all this ethnic group. By the time Sultan al-Hamid came along, this policy began to be reversed, and there was specific preferences given to Muslims in contracts and businesses, and the port, the Sublime Port, or the Bab al-Hadi, began to promote the advancement of Muslims within the state and bureaucracy and in business and military. So he put his ideology into practice to a large extent. And there was a number of newspapers also that were started and funded by the Ottoman state that promoted this new line of thinking. One of them was edited by a man called Ahmed Faris Shibyak. And this was very interesting because if you know Lebanon, you know that Shibyak is a Christian family. But Ahmed Faris Shibyak is an interesting character. There's a chapter in it, by the way, in Quran's book. His father was a Maronite priest, and he was accused unfairly by the Maronite hierarchy of stealing some state property. In many cases, he was arrested and then killed. And his son, in total disgust at the way that the Christian church behaved, and the Maronite church specifically behaved with his father, converted to Islam and moved to Istanbul and became a very, very powerful force in the Istanbul of Sultan al-Hamid. He was one of the great advocates of Pan-Islam and edited a number of newspapers and became the official spokesman, as it were, on the Arab side of the virtues and values of belonging to the Ottoman state as predominantly Islamic power. So Ahmed Faris was a powerful figure in the editorial world, newspaper world, and had a very strong literary style, but allowed his writings to be really avidly read throughout. And he was a very, very strong proponent of the Islamic College. Third person is a man by the name of Diyar, the Turks Museum of College. He was a poet who also started with young, like now, they were in the young Ottoman movement. But towards the end of the 19th century, they began to become the intellectual yeomen, as it were, of the Pan-Islamic movement. And both of them were active in cultural groups, organizational groups that promoted the concept of Pan-Islam, that promoted the spread of Pan-Islamic literature and views. Of course, we all know about Sayyid Jamaluddin Albani and his role in the propagation of Pan-Islam for the Arabic world, and subsequently, when he was brought to Istanbul, to the near Sultan, he became, although under rather tight circumstances, he was probably under house arrest most of the time. He was also another leading writer of that period. So these three groups are called the intellectual Pan-Islamic of Sultan. Now there is some talk that Sultan Ahmed himself was an adept or a murid of the Madani order, which is a Sufi tariqah. And there is quite enough evidence to say that he may have been recruited in the Shafi Madani tariqah. Now one of the angles of the policy of Pan-Islam of Sultan Ahmed was to concentrate on the Turuq, the Sufi Turuq. And what he did is, because the Sufi Turuq really included groups from nearly Muslim groups from nearly all the empire, as well as Turuq that were active in Muslim areas outside of the control of the empire, especially in North Africa. So he had with him in Istanbul 4 or 5 of the, not the main shiur, but certainly the key figures in some of the Sufi groups. And he had with him a man called, I think we talked about him, Abu Huda Sayyadi. No, Sayyadi, like as in Sayyid. Now, Sheikh Abu Huda Sayyadi was master of the Rafa'i order. Syria and also in Hijaz. He became, as it were, the religious advisor of Sultan Ahmed. And Sultan Ahmed wanted to use the Torah as a way of binding the millions of people who follow these tariqas to the authority of the Khalifa himself by bringing the leaders and the key shiukh of the Torah into his court. Another person, he had with him also the descendant of the founder of the Sanusi movement in Libya. And he used the Sanusi to do propaganda in parts of North Africa under the French control, especially in Tunisia. And there was quite a lot of threats made against the Ottomans by the French for using the Sanusi order in North Africa against them. So both the Shadli tariqat, of which he seems to have been a member, the Rafa'i tariqat, which was very active in Iraq, Syria, and Hijaz, and the Sanusiya, which was extremely active in North Africa and became one of the main bulwarks, as it were, against Western encroachments, especially in Libya when the Italians invaded Libya in 1911. The Sanusiya were right up there against them. So this was another anchor for this policy. Through newspapers, through journals, through cultural groups, through books and poems, he promoted the work of the main intellectual Pan-Islamic movement, and using the worldwide connections of the Sufi tariqas, he tried to bind them to the authority of Khalifa and tried to get them to accept his Khalifal powers, as it were. As I said, part of this may have been his own participation in the Shadli Maidan. The other element of this policy, as I was saying, is to draw non-Sunni powers, particularly Iran, into his orbit. And we discussed earlier as to how he was about to reach a very serious concordat or agreement with Iran to create a unified Islamic front before the assassination of Nasser ibn Shah. Another way in which this Pan-Islamic ideology was promoted is, in the absence of discussing it, he was very keen to send missions from Turkey to various parts of the Muslim world in order to promote his role as Khalifa. And there were missions sent to Africa, to Black Africa, there were missions sent to Central Asia, and there were missions sent to the Far East. And sometime towards the end of the 19th century, a Turkish warship sailed in the Indian Ocean and went to various points of the Asiatic and Far Eastern Muslim world and created a great sensation. It stopped in places like Ceylon or Calcutta or Java, and this modern warship and these Turkish officers and naval officers and crew and so on went down to pray with people who had never seen warships associated with Muslims. So that was extremely successful, and he began to bind a large number of individuals and groups in these far-flung parts of the Muslim world to his power of authority. And for example, in China, in eastern China, western China, the Xinjiang area, he promoted a number of attempts to create stability and unrest in that part of the world in preparation for the declaration of a Muslim state in East Turkestan, places like Xinjiang and so on. He also was very active in promoting attempts at rebellion, although they always had to be very careful so it doesn't spill over into a direct confrontation with great powers. For example, in the Caucasus, there was any number of rebellions and uprisings against the Russians, mainly led by, again, Soviet leaders, in the case of the Caucasus, the Naqshbandis. And a lot of these people found support and found finance in Istanbul. And of course, Sultan Hamid was right in the thick of it. So, all these attempts to promote and to project the Khalifal power of the Ottoman state was all really done in the service, as it were, of Pakistan. He had attracted to his court a number of people who had failed in various uprisings and various rebellions against imperial powers. And Istanbul became a center in the late 19th century of really quite a ferment of activity, as it were, in Pan-Islamic circles. Any number of journals were published. A lot of people could find, if not money, at least tea and sympathy of the Ottoman court. A lot of people who participated in various uprisings against the British in the Sudan, in Egypt, against the French in North Africa, against the Dutch in the East Indies, ended up, or some or most of the rest of their lives in Istanbul, and were given some kind of small stipend. And it kept, as it were, the role of Istanbul as the center of the Pan-Islamic movement. He was also very keen to get the Muslims in India locked up. He was under the impression, I think wrongly, that the Muslims were quite a wealthy group and that they were ripe for the picking. And he financed the establishment of a number of organizations and one newspaper here in London. And he thought of London as the center of the Pan-Islamic movement outside of, or second to Istanbul. So any activity that dealt with the British, that dealt with confronting the British, he wanted to coordinate through London, and his agents were active here also. Now, his relationship with the British was quite subtle. In some ways, the British were, because I work on the theory, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, they may have been in a position sometimes to stop serious encroachments against the territory. They were not that happy when the French took over Tunisia, and they kept the Italians away from North Africa for a long time. They were very careful about Russian designs in Afghanistan. So the British were not really an ally of the Turks, but they were not an enemy. But again, towards the end of the 19th century, another factor came into it, which is the relationship with the Germans. Now, the Germans, and this again went on subsequently in World War I and World War II, have developed a kind of reputation amongst Muslim circles as being sympathetic to Islam. And this is to some extent due to the activities of the Kaiser of the Germans. The Kaiser visited Istanbul 3 times. No other Western monarch or president had ever done that before. And in his second visit, he went to Istanbul and went to visit Beirut and Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, he announced that he was the protector of Muslims worldwide. The Germans also, at the end of the 19th century, began to be active in strengthening the Ottoman army and strengthening the power of the Ottoman army in resisting, in performing better in the various frontiers that they have. And they were responsible for possibly the only Ottoman victory in the 19th century, and they advised the Ottoman army in the First Balkan War, and they won a number of very famous victories. So the Germans entered into the equation as supporters of the Pan-Islamic ideology, as supporters of the notion of strengthening the Ottoman state and strengthening the Khilafah role of the Ottoman Sultan. So when World War I came along, there was an undercurrent of goodwill, as it were, amongst most Muslims towards the Germans. And when the Ottomans took the side of the Germans in World War I, it was generally well received by the majority of Muslims, thinking that because the Germans had no real claim on Muslim territory, their only colony then was in East Africa, Tanganyika, which had quite a substantial Muslim population. But they were not there long enough to create hatred and Muslims. So this connection between Germans, Muslims, and the Pan-Islamic movement, as it were, continued after World War I, and may explain, for example, why there was a natural, not affinity, but a liking for the German position, German policy during the interwar periods. We had a number of Muslim leaders who took refuge in Berlin in 1930, including Haji Hussein. So this sentimental, in some ways romantic connection to Germany can be attributed to the Kaiser's sponsorship in a very diluted form of the pan-Islamic ideology in Palestine, which features, by the way, in this book I told you about. John Buchan, who wrote these adventure stories and ended his life as the Governor General of Canada. He wrote a famous book called Green Mantle, which was a great sensation in the war, which showed the German Kaiser collaborating with the Mahdi and the attempt of Germany to mobilize Muslims in a holy war against England and France. So this was, again, another element of the equation. All of this came together, as it were, in formulating the outlines of this, what this fellow Jacob Landau calls the imperial ideology of the Ottoman state. Amongst the Arabs, apart from Al-Huda Sayyadi, you have, there was at that point, beginning of the 20th century, the formation of the Arab cultural and political groups, primarily founded and led by Christians. And although at that point, most, if not all of the Arabs were probably still looking to the Ottoman state as their natural home, the beginning of the sense of having a separate identity and a separate political destiny began to crystallize. There's no doubt that the promoters of the early Arab national ideology and nationalism generally were Arab Christians from Syria and Lebanon. For a variety of reasons. I mean, this for Ahmed Faris Sujata is an exception. But if you look at the people like Boutros Bostani, Yazji, these people were those who formulated, as it were, the national idea without necessarily confronting the role of the Ottomans. Subsequently, the beginning of the 20th century, this changed, and nationalism began to take more of a territorial definition. That is, the Arabs have a right to have their own nation, the Arabs have a right to have their own political state, and that the rule of the Turks over the Arabs is illegitimate even if it takes place in the form of a Muslim state. But this is really going ahead of our discussion. In the late 19th century, most Arabs, who formed possibly 30 or 40% of the Ottoman Empire, were, I would say, loyal citizens, and some of them were very, very fierce advocates of the ideology of Islam. Sheikh Al-Huda Sayyadi, unfortunately, was a controversial character and may have alienated more people than he helped. And if you recall the discussion we had with Abdurrahman Kawaki, he had already begun to formulate his anti-Hamidian ideology, as it were. And although he never parted ways with Islam as the underlying basis of his political thought, the focus or the attempt to create an Arab identity to the Muslim state haunted Sultan. So the pan-Islamic ideology towards the end of the 19th century began to be subverted to some extent, internally, from the inside, by notions of the Khilafah reverting to the Arabs. And there, apart from Abdurrahman Kawaki, there were a number of people who were promoting the Arab Khilafah. Amir al-Qadir al-Jazairi was one of the people. He was not promoting it, but he was being considered as a Khalifa. And the proponent of a Muslim empire under an Arab Khalifa was this person we talked about, the Yusuf al-Mat. And unfortunately, his activities and the activities of people like Abdurrahman Kawatibi, even the uprising of the Mehdi in Sudan, began to create the sense of fragility of the Turkish king, and began perhaps the process of Turkifying the state and undermining the non-ethnic or the trans-ethnic philosophy of Sultan al-Hamid. Towards the end of his reign, he was a fervent Muslim, a fervent believer in the Pan-Islamic movement and ideology. But he always had one eye cocked, as it were, to what the Arabs were doing. And there were beginnings then, late 19th century, of rumblings in places like Hijaz, the Sharifs, the uprising of the Mehdi, presence of various articles about the need to transfer the Khilafah from the Turk to the Arab. All of these began to come up as part of the Pan-Islamic movement. Obviously, this worked against his own thinking because he wanted to strengthen the concept of the Khilafah with healers and his successors as Khulafa. But when people started looking at this issue more carefully, it became possible, if not desirable, to consider the Khilafah as belonging to those from Arab descent.
Regarding this, where can we actually say that this idea came from the Arabs? Was it coming from like scholars like Arabi and something like him coming from the Arabi? Or would it be like more people make us to believe that it was usually not so creative?
No, the Arab national idea was much earlier than that. I would say in the middle of the 19th century. With the beginning of the printing press, with the reduction of, and then finally elimination of Turkish control over Egypt, what happened is that there was a kind of renaissance, as it were, of Arabic literary works, Arabic literature generally, and there was a reawakening, particularly on the part of the more advanced elements in the Arab world who were Christian, because they were much more exposed to Western missionary school. And also historically, especially Lebanon, they were involved constantly with Western Europe for trade. They found this opportunity to promote, first of all, very, very carefully, but then subsequently quite blatantly, the notion that the Arabs have a separate destiny, a separate history, a separate culture, and therefore should aim for a separate political independence, or a separate political state, political independence. And all of this was, it came to, I don't know if you have a talk devoted to this, but if you don't, I'll try to go for a very brief circle, the beginning of the Arab national movement. In the mid-19th century, you had Syrian Christians who, for one reason or another, began to redefine modern Arabic as a language, away from the classical ways of writing, the classical ways of Nahu and Sarf and so on, and in the interest of modernizing the language. So there were much more of a literary and cultural definition of the Arab. These people, Bobbas Bustani, for example, who had the first dictionary in Arabic, first modern Arabic dictionary, was promoted by Yaj, who started one of the main newspapers in Egypt, the Taqwa brothers who started the Ahram newspaper in Cairo. These people were more, I would say, liberals, in the sense that they were proponents of Western 19th century liberal thought. But they were not political, they were not overtly political, in the sense that they did not oppose the power of the Ottoman state over their own countries. Around the 1860s, there was a major uprising in Lebanon by the Druze against the Arabs, which led to large massacres both sides, many Maronites were killed, and there was a destruction of the Christian quarters in Damascus. As a result of this uprising, which had a number of roots which I don't want to know, but what it led to was a direct control, the loss of control of the Ottoman state over Mount Lebanon. Mount Lebanon became an autonomous state, and the foreign powers, in particular France, was given a kind of overseeing role over this province. This province was called the Mutasarrifiyya. Of Mount Lebanon, which includes nearly all of Lebanon, except the coast. This became an autonomous province, and developed, it was majority Maronite, and developed its own internal political administration. As a result of this, Christians became much more politicized and became much more aware, as it were, of the possibilities of that availed themselves for undermining the Ottoman state. And that was when the Arab literary renaissance of the mid-19th century began to change to an overt political movement which called not necessarily for Arab independence, but called for the uniqueness of the Arab condition of the Ottoman state. It really was aiming more towards a kind of dual state, dual nationality state, or dual nation state, something like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At the beginning of the 20th century, this began to attract Muslims, Arab Muslims. It stopped being mainly a Christian affair. And a lot of Muslims, especially officers, who became modernized with the Ottoman army, became influenced by the thoughts of the young Turks, began to be attracted to these circles, these political circles, cultural circles, based mainly in Beirut. And the first time that there was an attempt to convene a conference or congress of Arabs who had a particular position vis-à-vis the Ottoman Empire was in Paris in 1907, when there was it's well known in Arab history as the Congress, the first Arab Congress, which was mainly split between Muslims and Christians, 50-50, although 95% of Arabs were Muslims under the Ottoman Empire. But Christians had a very important role. And most of the Arabs came from established, notable families from Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. Most of the Arab Muslims, with a few Iraqis. And there was the birth of something called the Decentralization Party, Hezbollah Markazi, which called for increasing decentralization of the Ottoman state, more power to local governments and regional governments for Arabs, and more power to the Arabs who set their own standards of education, especially because at that point they had introduced, the young Turks had introduced Turkish as a requirement for all advancement of the state. And there was 8 years of Turkish taught in school, only 4 years of Arabic. Arabic was taught by Turkish teachers, so it created a lot of hostility and resentment. But there was no call for political independence. There was more towards greater autonomy, greater decentralization, and greater devolution of power. The first call for an independent Arab state may have been in 1911 or 1912. And one of the movements that came, there were two movements that grew out of this Arab Congress. One of them is this Hezbollah Markazi, this decentralization party. And the other one was the A Allawi, which was a movement of Arab officers in the Ottoman Empire, in the Ottoman army, a secret society that began to explore the possibilities of separation from the Ottoman state, but hadn't yet articulated specific ideology of their purpose. The ideology of Arab nationalism really came at the beginning of World War I. But before that, it was a gradual movement from being a literary cultural movement into being more of a movement that accepted the power and authority of the Ottoman state, but wanted more decentralization of the lives, more local government, more local autonomy, more local power. I think we'll be talking about that later on, but this really brief is the main the main response of the Arabs, as it were, at that level. I would say that if somebody had an opinion, took an opinion on the later, the vast majority of them saw their future in the context of the Ottoman state and were very fervent believers in the role of a Muslim state, the role of the state governed specifically according to the rules of the Sharia. It's only later. Next week, inshallah, we'll continue with the Pan-Islamic ideology, and we'll talk about the beginning also of the national movements, various parts of the Muslim world, and not just in the Arab world, obviously other parts of the national sentiment or national sentiments began to compete for people's loyalty from the ideology of Islam as an intellectual and political rather than religious